The Little Bookroom by Eleanor Farjeon. The Kind Farmer. If you heard tell of a man that all his life had been a stern teetotaler, refusing even the smell of liquor, and, after his prime, had tasted beer and ended a drunkard, you wouldn't be much surprised, I dare say. Well, then, don't you be surprised at this. The day that Farmer Robert Churton dismissed William Stowe from the farm for idleness, Will turned at the door and said in a shaking voice, "Mr. Churton, what you're doing may be the ruin of me and mine. Think twice." "I'm not such a fool, man," said Robert Churton, "as to spend 2 shot on a bird I've winged with one. Who wastes my time wastes my money. You waste my time. I've thought once, and that's enough." "And once will be enough for me," said poor Will, "the day that you or yours have need of me." "If I'd ever let myself have need of wasters," retorted Churton harshly, "I'd not have laid up store for my old age. If I'd ever had need of wasters, I wouldn't now have 1,000 fat acres, 200 head of cattle, a shop in Bone Market, the inn at Underbone, the mills on the Honey, and a nest egg in 6% in Bone Market Bank. It isn't me that'll have need of the likes of you, Stowe. And as for mine, there is no mine, and if there were, I could provide for 12 children and theirs to come, so that they'd never know the want you'll see this day when you go out of that door. And now you can go and face it." Stowe went. And that night, in the 50-odd dwellings and scattered cottages that made up the hamlet of Underbone, nothing else was talked of but the hardness and the prosperity of the farmer in their midst. There were few who in one way or another had not suffered from him. Those who worked for him, he drove to the hilt of time for the lowest wage in the country. Those he bargained with parted with more than their money's worth. He never put a penny in the parson's plate. He never subscribed 6 pence to the school treat. He never allowed a half-pint's credit at the inn, which was run for him by an old browbeaten acquaintance, with whom he did as he pleased. He turned his laborers out of doors on the slimmest pretext, if he saw he could get labor cheaper. The man to whom he spared skim milk for his pig mortgaged one part of the pig to him for this benefit. Gleaners were driven from his harvests and beggars turned from his door. And he prospered. Year by year he laid by more gold, bought more land, and increased his stock. His hay was the best in the shire. His corn and his fruit did not fail him, and he sold at top prices. Yes, he prospered, and his neighbors and dependents hated and feared him. For while he prospered, the village went down. Their gardens dwindled. Their homes went unrepaired. Their children wanted. He squeezed them all. Not a good word was to be heard of this hard man from Underbone to Bone Market, or from Bone Market to Beadon-on-Honey, where the mills turned other men's grain into Farmer Churton's 6%. But if he had not turned off Will Stowe with hard words that got their answer, it may be things would have ended different. For among poor Stowe's few rejoinders, one phrase stuck in the farmer's mind as a legacy. "You and yours," the man had said, "the day that you and yours have need of me." It was not the day or the need that stayed in Robert Churton's mind, but "you and yours" rang now and again in his thoughts as he trod his plowed fields and turned the pages of his passbook. Not that he dwelt on the thought. It only came in like a sort of refrain to a song of rich crops and full coffers. If it had not been there, like a pebble sometimes tossed uppermost in the surf of his thinking, his eye might have roved past Jane Flower's face at Bone Market Cattle Fair. As it was, it rested on that lovely face, and for the first time in his life, he wanted something which could not be turned into hard cash. But maybe, he thought, hard cash could buy it. She was a stranger to him that day, but not that night. Robert Churton did not shilly-shally when he knew what he was after. And he had not looked twice on that shining light brown hair, that fresh and smiling mouth, that creamy freckled skin, and those gray innocent eyes before he felt his heart turn over in his breast. He heard her speak to someone who was looking at the cow she had brought with her, and the sound of her voice in his ears was like water to a parched throat, the difference being that he'd never known of his own thirst till now. Stepping forward, he too examined the cow she held by a halter. "I'm looking for stock," he said. "What are you wanting for her?" "Oh, I am sorry," said Jane Flower. "I have just sold her." "What price did she fetch?" Jane named it. "I'll make it £1 above that," said Farmer Churton, to his own surprise. "You're ever so kind, sir," said Jane, "but she is sold already." It was the first time man, woman, or child had called Robert Churton kind. "Has the money been paid?" he asked. "I'm waiting for it now." "Then the deal's not clinched. You can better the price." "It was a fair deal, and I passed my word, sir." "I must not try to better the price after that, must I? But thank you all the same. She's a good cow, and he offered too little." "I've not seen you here before, have I?" said the farmer. "I'm John Flower's daughter from Camstock," said Jane. "You'll have seen my father, I dare say. But he's ill, and we wanted the money, so I said I'd bring Beauty to market myself. There's her new master coming for her now. I think he looks like one fond of beasts, don't you?" "Goodbye, my Beauty," said the girl, kissing the cow between the horns. She spoke cheerfully, but the look in her eyes made Churton's heart turn again. For a moment he hated the cow she kissed. The buyer came up and counted his money into Jane Flower's hand. She put it in her pocket, said good day to both men, and went away. Churton stared after her. Not a doubt of it, he thought. She'd brought Beauty to market, and now it was gone. "Goodbye, my Beauty." "By George, no." He turned to the cow's owner and looked the creature over. "That's a paltry lot you've bought," he said, thrusting out his hard lip. "Where were your eyes, man?" He ran over the cow's bad points. That evening his knock on John Flower's open door brought Jane Flower running to him. He saw her coming down the steep cottage stairs, not knowing him as he knew her, for his back was to the sun. But when she stood before him, "Why, it's you," she said, and held out her hand. It was said like a welcome, a new sound in Robert Churton's ears. Then, as he touched her hand, "Oh," she gasped, gazing beyond his shoulder, and her hand gripped his like an excited child's. "Yes, Miss Flower," said he, "that's your Beauty. She's come back to you." "But how?" "I've bought her, and she's yours. Put her in her stall." Jane looked at him speechless. She ran past him and threw her arms around Beauty's neck. This time Robert Churton could stomach it, for wasn't Beauty his proxy? When Jane had disposed of the cow for the night, she begged the farmer to step in and see her father. "I told him of your kindness to me today," she said, "but I did not know your name." "He'll thank you better than I can." Churton doubted that, but he stepped in and saw her father. John Flower lay back on his pillow and stared, while Jane poured out the tale of Farmer Churton's goodness. He stammered his thanks, but Churton soon cut him short and left him. For he knew enough of John Flower to know that John Flower knew still more of him. Jane walked with Churton to the gate. "I don't know what to say to you," she said simply. "I feel as though I ought to give you back Beauty's price, but we sold her because we had to have the money." "I don't want Beauty's price," said Churton. No need to mention that he had got the cow for £1 less than Jane had sold her for. "Then ought you not to take Beauty to your own farm?" "We'll see," said Robert Churton. "Well," said Jane Flower, "ask for her when you want her, sir, and thank you again for all your kindness." 3 months from that date Churton took Beauty to his own farm. John Flower had died in the meantime. Underbone gaped when the farmer drove his bride home. Why, the girl looked happy. Did you ever see the like of her smile? How do you figure it out? A poor girl might wed a prosperous man for his long stocking, but does the thought of a long stocking make you look like wild roses in June? In the 11 months of her married life, Jane Flower, that was, looked nothing else. Churton kept her close, and outside the house went his own way. But inside he made a secret indulgence of the things that made her say, "How kind you are," or "Look it." And he discovered very soon that such little things sufficed, things that, as often as not, cost nothing at all. He could get the word cheap by merely stooping for the first wild strawberries. Yet even after this discovery he would bring her a colored kerchief from some fair, or a packet of sweet stuff now and then, for which good pence must be paid out. By these means he kept her in the dark as to himself, and when, before the year was out, she bore him a daughter and died, she had never once in her short married life called him anything but kind. He called the child Jane Flower after her mother, but always spoke of her as little Jane, and he emphasized the little more than the Jane, because it was that word that made the difference and seemed less to shut his big Jane out. "How's little Jane?" he'd ask of the maid that looked after her. "Where's little Jane?" of the men in the fields. So in a few years she became little Jane to everybody, little Jane, all of a run. You'd have thought a man like him might have turned against the baby at first, but from the first she took her mother's place in his heart and carried on her mother's work, though it didn't begin to show until the child could speak. Before then he'd sit and stare at her in her cot, or carry her slung on his back like an Indian woman's babe, as he went about the fields. He didn't talk much to her, and perhaps as he stared at her and felt her little weight on his broad shoulders his thoughts were no more or less than me and mine. But that takes in a lot. Da came to her tongue, and other words followed, a sort of wonder to him, like the little shoots coming out of the earth that was ready for them, and like flowers in spring. Why, those things were a bit of a wonder too, come to think of it, but Farmer Churden never had thought of it like that before. The child's new words sprang out like early violets or the first green signs of corn. He took to listening for the new words and came to link them up with those other new things that are so old. So when in the summer just before little Jane was 2, he found the first wild strawberries in the 9-acre field. He brought them to her like a new word from the earth, as 2 years before he had brought them to her mother. Little Jane took the leaf full of tiny red balls with delight, and looking up at him, "Kinda," she crowed. And that was a new word for little Jane. It made Robert Churden's heart turn again in his breast. For where had little Jane got that word, if not from her mother? Of all her words, it was this he wanted to hear most. His ears were greedy for it, and he began to plan ways of getting it out of her. He brought her little toys from the markets. He took her more and more about the fields, showing her birds' nests and this and that. He began to look for things to show her and to notice what he'd never noticed before, only taken for granted. Now he could no more take for granted anything that might bring that word to little Jane's lips. And he couldn't take the word itself for granted unless he heard her say it often. As for what the word stood for, he hardly thought about that at all. He didn't know or care whether he was kind or not. But he wanted to hear little Jane say he was. One day he heard a child crying at the gate. He thought it was little Jane and ran to stop the sound at all costs. Little Jane was there, but it was another child crying, a girl perhaps a year older than his own. Little Jane toddled towards her father and pointing to the weeping one explained, "She lost her penny." Then she toddled back to the gate and explained, "My kind dad'll give you a penny." And she looked confidently at her father. To Robert Churden's surprise, he put his hand in his pocket and gave the tearful child a penny, and another thing that had hitherto been taken for granted went to the wall. For surely one didn't make pennies to give them away for nothing. A great uneasiness came over the farmer as he did it. He felt as though he had just parted with a fortune, and perhaps he had. But his little Jane was looking at him still with those confident eyes, and the other child had stopped crying and was scampering up the road, clutching her treasure. "What child's she, little Jane?" asked the farmer. "She's Molly." "And who's Molly?" "Molly's Molly," said little Jane. "That's her name." And Farmer Churden was no wiser. But that evening the 52 houses in Underbone were telling each other how Robert Churden, for the first time in his life, had given away a penny. And of all people, to Woolstos Molly. A few nights later there was more gossip running like wildfire from door to door. A tramp had come away from the farm with bread and a pair of old boots. Some said bread and meat and boots and a hat. "Nay, and a bottle of beer, they do say." "Aye, and farmer's old coat." "Never. But 'tis true." Sal Winters saw and spoke with him. He'd found little Jane Churden playing at the back door, and she marched him in to the farmer herself and said, "He's hungry, Dad." Them was her very words. Then the farmer gave him a parcel of food and other things. "What's come to Robert Churden? He'll be standing the school treat a shilling next." He did, 2 shillings. And little Jane Sheridan went to the treat, though she was too small for school, and came home crowing. Her father met the party on the road and picked her out of the mass of children and carried her home in his arms. Well, did you like it, little Jane? Ooh, I did, Dad. And she tucked her beaming face into his neck, repeating, I did, my kind dad. But over the head of his smiling, sleepy child, the farmer's face looked out with a queer bother in it. Next thing the village knew, he sent round word that little Jane would be giving a party to the village children. Little Jane had so much liked the treat the children had let her come to that now she was sure they must come to her treat. She sat on her dad's knee and explained this to him, and she told him what cakes and stuff they'd had at the school treat, and what games they had played, and what songs they'd sung. And she wanted her party to be just the same, only not in the woods, but in her dad's own hayfield and the big barn. See, Dad? Robert Churden said, all right, then, and thought, it'll not cost less than £3.10. Underbone couldn't believe its ears. It thought there must be some catch in it, but there was none. The children came and feasted, and none went short. Little Jane ran among them, too happy to make more than one bite at anything, too happy to play more than 1 minute with anyone. The children patted her, and not because she was a rich man's child. Come over here, little Jane. I'll make ye a haynest. Nay, come and slide down the big haycock, little Jane. I'll hold ye tight. It's little Jane's turn to skip now. We'll turn the rope. Who's my baby, little Jane? You are, ain't ye? Behind it all brooded Robert Churden with that new anxious look in his eyes. After this not a week passed, but there was food for talk. Little Jane now had the run of the village and was welcome everywhere. In the evening she sat on her kind dad's knee and chattered. Tommy Robinson's mam was in bed and never got up, and Tommy had nothing to eat all day. Susie Moore's bed was wet where the rain came through the wall. Gaffer Jennings cried because a hawk killed his 2 hens, and what would he do for eggs now? You'll give him 2 of your hens, I said, of course, Dad. Little Jane related the village sorrows with a cloudless brow. She knew that there was a panacea for all woes in her dad. Her dad could fill larders and mend leaky roofs. There were no sorrows for little Jane while her dad was in the world to put them right. And Robert Churden, who had never yet seen his child look unhappy, put them right. Underbone, in which his farm alone had had an air of well-being, Underbone bit by bit was put into repair. At last there wasn't a child in it that hadn't as dry a roof as little Jane's, and that didn't sleep as warm. There wasn't a man without sufficient ground and good seed of his own. It became the most prosperous hamlet in the shire, and was the talk of it. But the money it cost! And every penny spent was a penny spent away from little Jane's future. He knew it, and over again swore he would pull himself up, and after this one 'bout do no more of it. Mustn't a man think of his own child first? Mustn't little Jane's future be made safe? But tush! There was plenty left, and little Jane's presence was too powerful for him. So he went on with it blindly. It had gone, like drink, to his head, you see, or to his heart. Anyhow, once he'd begun, he couldn't stop giving. The village began to speak of him behind his back as Bob Churton and to venture a greeting when he passed by. There wasn't one he'd not done something for, and he looked as though he was being dogged. Little Jane fell ill and was taken to the children's hospital and cured. Till she came back, Churton was nearly out of his mind. Soon afterwards, a fire broke out in the hospital, and the small patients were got out safe, but the place was gutted. Hard on this news came the news that Churton had sold the mills at Beaton-on-Honey to build up the hospital again. Because it was urgent, he had sold at a loss. The buyer chuckled over his bargain. The village gaped. The hospital blessed Churton's name, and Churton hugged his little Jane to his breast and saw poverty stalking on them both. Even then, he'd no cause to fear anything but his own obsession. But he was incurable now. Wherever there were things to be done for children, he did them, and if they didn't come his way naturally, he went looking for trouble, as you might say. You'd have to go deep for the explanation, but I expect the truth was that once this habit of giving to little Jane had got its grip on him, what he could give straight to her seemed soon finished and done with. For after all, there's an end to the benefits you can pour upon any one person by the mere spending of money. The only way to go on giving to his child was to give to all children, so he did, and the queer thing was that the less he had to give, the freer his giving became. Some of the things he did the village knew of, but there were more of which they never got wind at all. And all the while, he was going about with that worried look on him, as though he had a haggard conscience, and what he couldn't help doing put too great a strain on heart and mind. Like a man with a secret vice he tries to rid himself of and can't. And while his property and savings were shrinking every week, and people were blessing and praising him near and far, he never once tried to tie up even a small sum to make little Jane safe. Safe? The laughing, lovely thing! What danger was she in with that look in her eyes of trust in the kindness of her dad and of all the world? Would it have mattered to her, even had she known, when the shop in Bow Market was auctioned, when Churton sold out his last investments, when the inn was taken over by a new man? Did it matter to her when her father said to her one day, "How'd you like to live with me in Underbone Cot instead of this big farmhouse, little Jane?" "In the teeny cottage in the wood," cried little Jane. "Oh, Dad, I'd love it." So they went there, and someone else farmed Bob Churton's fat acres, and the Bow Market Orphanage got the biggest check it had ever received from an unknown donor. You see, Bob Churton began to feel he was breaking up. The worry of it all was wearing him down, and he had a secret pain he told no man of and grudged the doctor's fee for, and he'd begun to think of his little Jane left without father or mother. And so the orphanage was enriched. He and little Jane lived for about a year in that woodman's cottage. During this time his big schemes dwindled, for he had nothing left to spend on them. But it is a fact that also at this time the furrow smoothed out of his brow, and the anxiety cleared out of his eyes. He hadn't a penny now to cling on to for little Jane's sake, so when he thought of her future he knew there was nothing for it but to trust in God. And the man who does that takes the heart out of his care. He hired himself out as laborer on his own farm, and when his wage had provided porridge for two, he and little Jane went for Sunday walks, and gave away whatever he had left to the beggars on the road. He'd look at her with that new clear look of his as he trudged home with empty pockets, while she danced through the woods ahead of him, knocked at the cottage door, cocked her head to listen, called "Come in" to herself, went in and sat down to wait for his knock. "Come in, Dad." "Good evening, Miss Little Jane." "Good evening. Did you have a walk?" "Yes, and a nice walk too." "Who did you see?" "A beggar or so." "What did you give them?" "A penny or two." "What did they say?" "Thank ye kindly, sir." "Thank ye, kind sir, you mean, Dad," said little Jane. After this they supped, and there was nearly always something more than bread and milk, for people liked giving little Jane a basket of fruit or a honeycomb. And many a time when a pig was killed, some bit of it was taken along to Bob Churton, to Bob's, as all now called the cottage in the wood. For during this year they'd come to speak of him as Bob and to hail him by the name. Just run down to Bob's with these chitlins, Tommy, or Louie. Leave this couple of eggs at Bob's as you go by became common words on a woman's tongue that year. Then one morning little Jane came early to William Stowe's house and said, "I can't wake my dad up." "Can't you?" said Stowe. "Sit down and have breakfast with Moll, and I'll go and see." Little Jane stayed all that day, and the day after, and the day after that, when Bob Churton was buried. The whole village walked behind him to the churchyard. By then it was known that he had died penniless, and that no child was ever left more destitute than little Jane Flower Churton. I don't know who it was that first mentioned the Bone Market Orphanage, but you should have seen William Stowe flare up at the word. "Send Bob Churton's child to the orphanage?" he cried. "Not till my own must go too. Little Jane's come to my house, and there she can stay. I'd not think twice about a thing like that." Then a woman spoke up. "Nay, Will, you can't afford another. Let me take little Jane. I'm better able than you, and I owe her father a debt I never hope to pay." "Why, so do I, if it comes to that," said another, "and I feel as if the child was one of mine." Others chimed in. Bob Churton had done this, had done that, and t'other. He'd ruined himself for their children. And was his child to suffer because her father had had a kinder heart than one man can support? Why, the whole village was in debt to him. And now he was gone. Who was little Jane's parent but the village? And so it ended. That village stood father and mother to Bob Churton's child, the child he couldn't make safe. Each of the 52 homes put in its claim and kept her for 1 week in the year. And there wasn't one, from the parson to the stonebreaker, that wouldn't have rejoiced to keep her the year round. Little Jane passed happily from home to home, and in all she heard her father spoken of as the kindest man that ever lived. The kind farmer was the name his memory went by, there and in distant parts. Underbone became noted for the man, and proud of him, who for the sake of all children had left his child with nothing. Yet in the end, you might say, he had left the whole village to little Jane Churton, for every roof and hearth in it was hers.